Chair Lowe, it's great to have you with us.
Good morning. Aloha.
Aloha. Well, I'm excited to talk about the National Endowment for the Humanities, but I'd love to start sort of way back and just hear a little bit about kind of where you're from and where you grew up.
Okay, thank you. I grew up in Northeast Arizona in a small rural community on the Navajo Reservation. My mom is white, my dad is Navajo. My mother's parents had come out to be teachers on the reservation in the 50s. And it was beautiful. I grew up in a small community surrounded by both my mom's family, my dad's family. All of my aunts and uncles went to the same schools that I did, graduated from the same schools. I saw my cousins every single day. I played outside. We were a very close community. We knew everybody. And it was beautiful. It was kind of magical when you kind of think back to how safe we were, how we felt just surrounded by family and culture constantly. I think that one of the other beautiful parts, and some people may not think that this is beautiful, is that I grew up not really knowing what the rest of the world was and what it looked like and what, big cities were. I had been to Phoenix, I had traveled a little bit, but I was really kind of insulated in a rural, beautiful part of the world and didn't know much about what else was going on.
Did you, what was it like for your parents? Like my dad came from India in 1968.
Yep.
My mom's from Wisconsin. Sort of about as much the opposite of India as you could
Right.
sort of imagine.
Right.
And I think they talk about their early years being together very similarly.
Yeah.
But as he's gotten older, he reflects on sort of what he didn't notice, the anxiety he didn't notice,
Right.
the ignorance he didn't notice, the fear he didn't notice.
Right.
I love hearing you say it was beautiful.
Yes.
Was it beautiful for them? What was it like for them?
When I reflect back and I think about, the time period that I was growing up in, there was a lot of transition within the Navajo tribe and the Navajo communities. So we had come through the era of assimilation. Mm-hmm. So, I wasn't taught to speak Navajo. Mm-hmm. My family and my parents felt like it was much more important that I speak English and that I do that very well. Because if I was going to be successful, I needed to be able to speak English and do really well academically with that English background. But there was a lot of tension that I saw, and I think back to, between what it meant to be a traditional Navajo person who really lived in the culture, practiced the culture, versus what it meant to be a Navajo who was assimilated, who spoke English, who went to church, and believed in God and Christianity. And those tensions were playing out, I think, fairly often. So there were a lot of people who would say negative things about Navajos who were more traditional and practiced the culture. And those Navajos would be very judgmental and say things about Navajos who were becoming very Christian and would go to church. So it was something that I think I knew was around, but I was in a good place, and I was around family, and I was around culture, and I've seen it kind of transition now kind of over the years to be, how do we deal with this changing culture? How do we deal with the fact that Navajos now are interacting with all cultures, that are coming onto the reservation, or Navajos that leave the reservation and are in other places? What does it mean to stay Navajo, but to be interacting and understanding and being respectful of people who are, trying to do the same for us, understand us?
What do you like? We're in a moment where, and to some extent this is a powerful sign of progress, we have a really sort of acute discourse to talk about the ways in which things like assimilation are tools of coercion, can obviously be tools of profound oppression. I think too, like my dad, he gave up so much of being Indian to sort of be an American businessman. Yep. But then there's other things he never gave up. Yeah. He's a Sikh from Punjab. He still wears a turban. He's worn a turban like every day of his life practically. Never gave up his language. Never did. But I didn't see the things he was giving up as things that he was shedding forcibly, or that he felt he was discouraged, whether the structures were sort of visible and palpable or sort of invisible. I was acutely aware of the difference. Right. I wasn't acutely aware of the choices he was making or that were being made for him. Did you have a sense at that time of the difference between sort of assimilation is a coercive practice and assimilation is, well, this is just how my family lives. Like we come from these two worlds and I pick up some from this world and some from that world.
I don't think that I had really understood it until I left the reservation and I went to college. When we were in school, we were given American education. We weren't taught our own really Navajo history. We weren't really taught federal Indian law and federal Indian history, what was going on, why we were on a reservation. Like those things I didn't know until I had gone to college. What I was kind of understanding, or the message that was kind of being told to us, was these cultural practices aren't important anymore. You don't need those things anymore. You need to read English. You need to understand, this white way of living and be Christian and live that way. And that was what was going to give you a good life, and you could be prosperous, right? You could do well. And it wasn't until I got to college and I started to take American Indian Studies courses and I started to learn the federal Indian policy over the years, and to say, that's kind of messed up, and really kind of understanding why you see, or why I was seeing reservations the way that once I left, right, then I understood that people looked at reservations as they were poor, people were uneducated, people were not going to do well, that there was this still idea sometimes that the cultures were going to disappear, that we as Native people were going to disappear and no longer be there. And to kind of understand how that mentality, how that idea came to be, how federal decisions, how federal policies had created this kind of history that really isolated Native people, really tried to take away who they are, how they lived, their understanding, their knowledge, and really thinking how really, negative that practice was, and how damaging it really was, and how nothing was being done really to counteract that damage that had been done. And then, then feeling like, okay, we have to change this. How do we make this different? How do we counteract that? How do we really build up tribal communities and make them stronger and better?
Did that influence your relationship with your family? Like you wouldn't be, you're describing a kind of a revelatory experience, and I think we'll get to some extent, that's sort of what higher education is for, is to awaken the soul.
Right.
Did you, and you wouldn't have been the first college student to sort of been radicalized,
Right.
did you come home a different person? Did it start to influence how you saw your own childhood, your own family, your own community?
Yes, and I think that, some of the things that happen when you go to college and you come back and you've got all this knowledge now and you're really excited about it, you're energized.
It feels authoritative to you.
Well, you're disturbed a little bit, right? But no, you don't, as Native people, technically we don't come back trying to be authoritative for the most part. But, it was more about being respectful of understanding where my family came from. So my grandparents on my mom's side, they thought they were doing the best thing for us. They were part of the assimilation process. That they thought teaching us things that were based on Christian values and white values was really the best thing that we could have. And they never saw anything negative in what they were doing, and I don't think they do today. It really for them was about helping the community to be American and to live and be prosperous as American Christian people. And so, and then on the other side, kind of being with my dad's family, being respectful and understanding that they are still on the reservation and they are still living within a system that we have to think about building back up and being strong, and kind of thinking about bringing culture back in order to do that. But understanding that their knowledge and their experiences are not the same, right? They've still kind of in the same place. My grandparents on my mom's side were still kind of in the same place, but I had gained this knowledge to understand better how those two things had been interacting, and maybe how we think about having conversations to move it forward. It was about really being respectful and listening, and just understanding better the situations that I grew up in and my parents and my family were still living in.
I remember being like, I went to college at the time where there was like a post-colonial studies reader, had reached that stage of institutionalization of knowledge. And I remember, I think I wasn't so naive that I was going to come home and say to my parents, like, we're complicit, in this project.
Right.
But I was close to that,
Right.
and I really worried about it. And what I remember is I didn't know how to talk to my dad
Right.
about the questions that were being raised for me, and we had a great relationship. But I just didn't know. I had been to India. It wasn't a sublimated part of our experience.
Right.
But I remember once when I was in college, he recommended to me a V.S. Naipaul novel called A House for Mr. Biswas, about an Indian emigrant to Trinidad, huge South Asian population in Trinidad, and a really moving portrayal of both why people make these moves, but the costs of these moves psychically and to community. And I remember thinking later, that's how he could talk about it. Like, that's how we could talk about it.
Yes.
Like, you know, that was an early humanities moment for
Yes.
me. I didn't know how to ask the question. He didn't know how to raise the question.
Right.
But that was probably more productive than me snidely asking, what does it really mean to pursue a liberation of, to some middle class Minnesotan at that point?
Right.
You know, has this been a topic in your family? The way the development of your own ideas about what justice means in a country that has the kind of history that this geography has between tribal indigenous people and it's sort of now descended from colonial settlers?
No, not at all. I think, talking about being kind of respectful, the conversation is more among my peers. So, talking with those individuals who are the same age as me, who had kind of the same experiences, who had this kind of eye-opening, oh, this is why things are the way they are on the reservation. And then this kind of desire to say, what do we do? How do we help to change things? How do we help to make things better for either our families on the reservation, our communities, our tribe in particular, or even just our tribal members and Native people in general, right, across the United States. I worked with Native students in colleges for many years, and I love to see them come in eager, excited, and then you can see that point where they get the same realization. This is why this is the way Native people are. They start to understand what has happened to Native people, and they get really energized and engaged and angry sometimes. And they want to get out and they want to do things, and it lasts for a certain amount of time, right? There's this enthusiasm you have in college, right? You've learned all of these things and you get so excited about it. And then you get into doing an actual job and the real work.
You crash into the
right?
real
And
world
then
a
you're
little
kind of
bit.
like, okay,
You have responsibilities and you have
responsibilities,
yeah.
and then the ability and the time to just be a student and learn and kind of have these conversations among other people starts to diminish a little bit, because then you get busy in a professional role and you have to do your job. And it's not that we don't remember that kind of real intense feeling that I need to do something and that we need to have these. We need to be, out there protesting, and we need to be doing all of this stuff. It's just that we start to figure out how do we then use those tools, right, to say, what is the most convenient but also effective way for me to be able to inform others, to help others understand, and to help move things forward in a way that we think is most appropriate. And not just we, but like we in conversations with our communities and conversations with our neighbors even, how do we move this forward in the right way? So I love my college students, and I love seeing them 10 years after when they're tired and they're still excited.
What's a coal that sort of burns like lower but hotter?
Yes, right, exactly.
For some of
and
them.
will continue to burn, right? And then continue to keep heating everything. But it's fun. But I don't see a lot of conversation between students and then going home and having these deep discussions with family and community. But once in a while, because they've had parents who were in college and who are back home and who are really trying to do this work. So I see a lot of things that start up in the tribal communities being done by young people, because they're coming back and they're coming together. And then they are working with older family members and community members to try to move this forward. But I see a lot of young people doing things now, going back home and trying to make some changes.
So tell us then about, coming back to your journey, this fire is stoked. How does that shape your studies, and then where do you go from there?
So my fire gets stoked because I had come into college, grew up on the reservation, went to school on the reservation. I got this really nice scholarship. It's called the Flynn Scholarship. And I got into college. The scholarship is for, like the top students in the state. And I struggled,
Uh-huh.
I had a really hard time trying to figure out how to be a college student, how to study, how to do my classes. I took calculus for the first time ever, had no idea what that was, did not understand anything the instructor was saying.
Not that relevant to the revolution.
Right? Failed calculus. First time I ever failed
Wow.
a class in my
Wow.
life. That really shook me, and
Yeah.
I was like, why is this so hard?
Yeah.
I took a semester off, and I went home. I went back to the res, and I
Oh, wow.
was kind of like, I had to kind of really think about where I had come from. Why was this going to be such a hard experience for me? Why? And I also had people telling me that I was never going to make it, that I was going to fail, because Native students were statistically failing and not graduating. And so it became really difficult for me to say, I'm not going to fail, right? But I had to understand, what is it that I need to be able to do to be a student and to be successful. So I went back, and then I started to get straight A's, right? The normal things that I was used to. Figured out how to be a student, but figured out how to be a student the way I needed to be a student. I went in and classes, I worked. I wasn't a student that did extracurriculars. I wasn't doing a lot of other things. I just had to go and be a student that I knew how to be. And I had a lot of classmates, especially my other Flynn scholars, be like, well, we got to go do this event, and we're going to go do this, and having all this kind of fun stuff. And I was like, no, I have my schedule I need to keep to, and I'm going to do this.
And did that all just come from inside?
Yeah, I just kind of somehow I
Wow.
figured it out. But I watched my classmates, and I watched other Native students on campus who left and who didn't graduate and who didn't come back. I started looking into the data on Native students, and it was showing us that Native students weren't graduating. And I could hear all those people who were saying, you're never going to graduate, you're just a Native student, you're never going to graduate. And I decided that I need to change that. This is not right. Someone like me, really great academically, great scholarship, why did I struggle? What was going on? So I decided to go into working in higher education. So I did student affairs. And it comes to the realization that sometimes it's not me, it's not the Native students.
Yeah.
It's the institution, right? It's the institution that doesn't know how to help Native students be successful.
Yeah.
It hasn't set itself up for that. And I think that's a problem, and so I decided that was the work I was going to do.
But it's interesting, your story is, on the one hand, a story about being a part of a generation that has reshaped higher ed, and really to understanding, disadvantage as a structural phenomenon.
Right.
That you've got students who aren't showing up with certain expected skills. You've got a narrow view of what success looks like and talks like and walks like, and you're not equipping. And yet your story is a story of agency. Like, there's almost a sort of a Martin Luther, here I stand moment in your story. I'm not going to be the statistic.
Yes.
How do you, and sometimes I think today, especially when I talk to younger people, it feels like a choice. Like, it's either all structural or it's all agency. But if I make any concession to agency, then I'm complicit in the structure. I'm justifying the structure. How do you think about the relationship between sort of the agency of the individual and the overpowering force the structure can bring to bear on the individual?
I think that as for me in particular, the agency of the individual has to be supported. Mm-hmm. And so one of the reasons I was able to really transition and get really energized about thinking about this work of helping Native students, I had a mentor. And my mentor had been doing this work, and she was Native. She was a Native faculty member on campus. And, she would tell me, she would make remarks about, the institution, needs to do this, but they haven't figured that out yet. And so that helped me. She helped to guide me. She also helped to introduce me to tribal communities across the country, to how institutions work, like what is the role of faculty, how does staff work, what does administration do. That really helped I had the agency, but I needed somebody to help mentor me and to help me go into the right spaces and get the right information to be able to really build that agency and use it, and to understand the structure itself. So one of the things she did was really, in her time and experience being on a campus, is help me understand that structure in a better way, where, one of the things that I always say when I work with students is, they understand the university from their point of view as a student. They have no idea how the rest of it is working, right?
Yeah.
She helped me understand how the rest of it worked. And if I was going to make this change and really work within institutions, I needed to know how the institution worked. And so I think that we have to have individuals who are our champions, who are helping us and guiding us in the right way and putting the information in front of us that we need to have, right? So if I didn't have that, I don't think I would have been successful.
Well, we're like in a moment where I think a lot of people wonder, can institutions work?
Yes.
Like, can they be
Right.
improved?
Well,
And
or
I
can
think
they
your
change?
point, can they change? And I think your point is, it's hard to know if you don't really understand how they
Yes.
work. You may come to the
Yes.
conclusion
Yes.
it needs to be burned down
Yes.
or reimagined.
Yes.
So then, a part of your career in higher education takes you to leading programs at Harvard and at Yale, which in some ways are sort of the beachheads of a tragic movement of colonization in this country that leads to Arizona,
Right.
Along a painful path.
Yes.
And really meaningfully beachheads, right? Like building a university is a real commitment to a future. That's the sign you're not going anywhere.
Right.
What led you to those experiences, and how did those experiences shape your outlook?
So it was the students. I had finished my coursework for my PhD at Arizona, and at that time they told you couldn't work in the institution where you got your degree. You had to go someplace else, get your experience, and then maybe you could come back, right?
It's such an unstructured environment. It's weird they're so specific about those rules.
Yes, exactly.
You know?
The way that you mentored people back, sometimes I just cringe. But I started applying for positions, and I got a call from Yale, and they said, well, we want to interview you. And I said, okay. It had been a few months since I had put the application in, so I didn't think anything was going to come out of it. And I ended up flying there, doing a campus visit, meeting with the students and faculty, and it was the students. I met this group of students. They were a small group. They were largely students from reservation areas, plus a couple of students who were urban natives, and they were just, it was like, and I hate to say this about them, it was like they were puppies in a box, right? Pick me up, take me home, take me home. They were so amazing, and I was so impressed with them that they chose to leave their communities to come to this very traditional, the Ivy League institution. And, if you've been to Yale's campus, it looks very traditional Ivy League institution. They were struggling. They were point blank honest with me and said, this is what we need. This is what we're confronted with. This is what we're having a hard time and what we're struggling with. And I understood exactly where they were coming from.
Well, you went through it.
I had gone through it. Not in the same kind of institution, but and I knew I had asked all kinds of questions of individuals across the campus, about the structure. And when I left after the interview, I got onto the plane and I cried a little bit.
Wow.
I still cry a little bit. And I just prayed and I said, please take care of them. And then they called me and said, we want to give you the job. And I said, that's really far away. But I took the job, and I told everybody, I'm leaving, I'm going to Yale, I'm going to take this job, and nobody was excited for me.
Really? Why?
Everybody was like, why would you go to that institution? Right, and not that institution as in Yale, but that institution with the history that it has, right? The role that you were just talking about. There's also, in I think some people's minds, when you go to institutions like that, you don't come back. And not come back as
co-opted.
in we'd sent our kids away to these schools.
Oh, wow.
They died, they never came back.
Oh my God, wow.
Right?
So of course
And
there was this historical trauma.
So there was this kind of like, why can't you stay here and do this work and make a difference here? And it was like, I gotta go. If you had met these students, you would know I have to go and I have to help them there. So that was my transition into the other side of the United States and a different institution. And
well, right. As I listen to you, it's sort of, these students are committing at the same time both a radical act of resistance, like I will stand here, I will be here, but also of optimism. Like if you're going to hang around, then I'm going to be a part of this.
Right.
And you need the naivete of the puppy, right? In a sense, to do something so profound. And I'm sure they heard exactly the same thing from their parents and family too.
Yes.
You're leaving us.
Yes. Oh yeah. A lot of them had a really hard time with family. But I think the other part of it was once I got into the institution, once you kind of got a good sense of guess who their alum are, guess where they are, what roles they play, what jobs they're in. It was really important for me then to say, of course Native people need to be here. Of course we need our students because you need to be in these roles as well. And at one point we had a speaker that I was at Harvard, he came in and he saw all these Native students from across the Ivy Leagues and he said, one of you in here is going to be the future president of the United States.
Wow.
And I was like, that is exactly why we do this, because these students are going to have this amazing education in these institutions, create these opportunities and pathways to be in positions where we probably imagined and thought about it, but now we can actually see that will probably happen, and that to me was like, we have to be able to make sure these students can be here and be successful.
And do you see that momentum? Does that in retrospect feel like exactly the turning point, exactly the beginning of what you have wanted? It's never going to move fast
Right.
enough, but but are you seeing the
Yeah.
kind of, you are?
I do.
What are the signs to you?
So the number of students that go into Ivy League institutions now, or just higher education in general, Native students, the way that they are, depends by community, right? So just Tuesday, we were in the mud, we were in the lo'i, and we were, pulling weeds. And one of our former students, who is Hawaiian, Native Hawaiian, she came over and she's running a cultural center now in her community, right? So she's an example of students who are coming into the institution, unlike me, who was told English, go to church. She comes in having Hawaiian language, learning her culture, learning her stories, learning everything about what it means to be a Native Hawaiian, and bringing that with her into Harvard. And, having to, be able to understand what it means to be a Native Hawaiian person in this institution that's clearly not Native Hawaiian or built upon Hawaiian cultural values. But to keep that as her strength, and then to come home and to really start leading things in her community. It was so amazing to see her, just her leadership and her ability to say, I did that, I can use now what I have. And, people will take her seriously. She's got a Harvard degree. And so, the Harvard kind of network will look at her and say, she's doing this great work, maybe, and then how can they get involved as well? So I see Native students in higher numbers going into not just Ivy League and selective institutions, but institutions where we didn't think about very often, smaller private institutions, really getting that experience and being able to kind of open up their network and come home and do these great things.
And do you see, in some ways returning to the beginning of the conversation, a kind of assimilation is to have that strength, to have a cultural specificity, but then to enter an institution that is at best indifferent, which is a kind of discouragement. Yeah. And I sort of think of, I don't speak Punjabi,
right,
but my wife is from Brazil, and something, my kids are in elementary school. The school values that about them. Okay. It celebrates that about them. A part of our life is bringing them back to Brazil during the summer. And that feels like a really big difference to me. Like my elementary school, high school, college accepted my difference, wasn't particularly interested in my difference. Do you think now that student goes to Harvard and Harvard says, not only is this a part of who she is and we need to and want to include it, but it adds to our campus? Or are we still working on that?
We're still working on that. Very much so. And some of it, I wonder, with your kids and their experience, who are the teachers now? Who are the individuals who are in the institutions?
Yeah.
Right. They're individuals that do actually value that. They do understand, the strengths that your kids bring in, being of different cultures, and how that can play into the learning of kids. I don't think that, my teachers weren't like that. Right. Right.
Well, and also the school, we've invented a new social technology. Like the school has a diversity, equity, and inclusion lead. And we're in a moment where there is a really reactionary kind of politics around that. Yeah. And, to whatever you call it, there is an expertise to doing this in ways that aren't appropriative,
Right.
that aren't tokenistic, that aren't essentializing.
Right.
By the way, like my kids they grew up in the their idea of the United States is this kind of diversity,
Yes.
and so there's a methodology to this, and we can, if we have to change, if the price we have to pay is changing the name, fine. But I hope that the lesson we're not learning right now is that this is just about goodwill.
Right.
I mean, that is to portray a fundamental understanding of what it means to be for a problem to be structural.
I feel like sometimes it's about being open to understanding, and that the more you understand about other cultures, the stronger you are. And, I feel like there are so many people that want you to be educated and they want you to have knowledge, but, part of having knowledge is having an understanding of other people and the strengths that they bring. And I don't understand why that might be bad in any way.
Yeah.
That's just me.
The comment section will, I'm sure, offer sage insight. So then you move from these environments, you become the chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Yes.
What is the National Endowment for the Humanities, kind of first and foremost? Why was it created?
I mean, I love that you asked that question, because when I started with the endowment as a council member. So I was at Harvard and I got a phone call from a very young woman. Is this Shelly Lowe? Yes, it is. And she just goes on to quickly say, President Obama has looked at your resume and is really impressed and would like to know if you would be interested in serving on the Council for the National Endowment for Humanities. And I thought she was a scammer. I thought she was, I did not take her seriously whatsoever. But the process it worked out. But when she got off the phone, I had to look it up. I had to say, what is the National Endowment for Humanities? 1, 2, what is humanities? Like, I had to look up the definition of humanities. And one of the nice things about being in the NEH and working with the NEH National Endowment for Humanities is being able to tell people how difficult it is to explain humanities to the general public or just to another person, right? We hear humanities and I think sometimes we think, oh, I know what that is. But the reality is, if we really start to break it down, sometimes we have no idea what we're talking about when we say humanities. But the National Endowment for Humanities, we're a federal agency. We were created with the National Endowment for the Arts in 1965. And our job is to promote and to support humanities across this country, to really build up all of the things the tools, the things that we need to understand ourselves as human beings and the experience of human beings, right? So in our legislation, it says democracy demands wisdom in its people, and part of having humanities support and programs is strengthening that wisdom, that understanding, and being sure that it's open to all Americans, that we're providing this to everybody.
And how do you describe kind of where the humanities starts and ends?
So I tell people, we had a really great person yesterday tell us what humanities is. I tell people that when I was trying to figure out what is humanities, because if you look up the definitions, not helpful. And really like, what?
In a very humanities way.
Right, exactly.
It raises more questions than it answers.
So to me, humanities is our creation stories. It's those things that we were told about how we came to be in the world as human beings, how we're supposed to live in the world, how we're supposed to have relationships with each other, how we're supposed to live in the environments that we live in, so the natural world, right? All of those things. So my experience here the past few days, I've heard people say, our stories are those vessels of knowledge that sometimes we haven't had a chance to have access to, but that are just kind of waiting there for the seeds of us as human beings to be able to germinate in the right way, right? We need those vessels of knowledge to live the right way and to be who we need to be in the world. But a gentleman yesterday said, for him, the humanities are a Hawaiian quilt, that the base of the quilt is kind of human beings, right? It's us as a human race. And then the top and the designs are the different cultures that you have in the world. And then each individual stitch is an individual person that kind of goes in between those cultures and the human beings, right? That creates this beautiful, large quilt that, like we're kind of all under or sitting on or, make use for us.
Well, and a quilt is so human too.
Exactly.
As a tactile artifact. So, I mean, it's amazing that we live in a country that says we should invest in wisdom.
Yes.
what does that look like practically? What are
Right.
some of the big
Right.
priorities of the NEH today?
So, I was so glad that he had talked about the quilt, because when I came in, I had come in, right, being on the council for 6 years, seeing the work that the agency was doing, seeing where our funding had been going, seeing, we have some just amazing humanities programs happening across the country, but also seeing that there were lots of organizations, lots of communities, entities that were applying that were not getting funded. So, as a Navajo person, I was always looking for the tribal applications.
Yeah.
Who was applying, what were their projects, and fairly often, most of the time seeing them as not recommended applications. I was looking for community colleges. I was looking for small institutions, because I had been at a conference in Vermont, the New England Museums Association conference, and this was when I was on the council. Program officer had been there as well. She did a session with some of the attendees of the conference, and they were small organizations, small cultural centers, historic houses in the New England area. And she, one person came in and said, "I don't know why you're talking to us. You don't fund small organizations." And, that was exactly kind of what I had been kind of thinking myself after, reviewing where our funding was going, where funding wasn't going. It was always in my mind, why aren't we, funding these smaller organizations? Why aren't they rising to the top in terms of peer review and the amazing work that we should be funding? So I came in and, I basically said, I just want to know, and I want to figure out how we can do this. How do we fund these small organizations? And some of these entities have applied for years, and still haven't been funded, haven't been successful. We created an initiative called American Tapestry. So this is where the quilt kind of comes in. I wanted to tell the gentleman yesterday, we call it tapestry, and we called it tapestry because, quilt is very specific in certain instances of a type of tapestry. Blanket is, woven sometimes in a different way. Rug is a different thing. So we chose tapestry to try to think about exactly what he said. What is that kind of diversity that brings things together, interweaves and pulls us in to knowing and having more access to knowledge, to be able to share that knowledge, to be able to use that knowledge to make decisions and be, really effective citizens, right? So our new initiative really focuses on how do we braid together strengthening our democracy, equity for all, and addressing our changing climate. Those things that we have really been kind of in front of us for, I would say a few decades, but that we really need to start paying attention to as we think about how we move forward together and in relationship with one another and in relationship with our environment. So we've got some new programs that focus on how to support small organizations, grant lines that are focused on how do we create resilient institutions that can mitigate some of the changes we see in climate, that can be prepared for changes that may be coming so that we can save our cultural heritage, we can protect our cultural heritage so that it's there for the future. How do we ensure that we are informing ourselves as a society at all ages about what it means to be a citizen, what it means to be part of this democracy, and understanding, why we are here in this democracy, how we got here, and thinking about what we want to see into the future of that democracy. So it's been really exciting. The program directors developed some new programs, and you don't always get to develop new programs, but it's been very exciting. And there's, and it moves on from there with other things that we've been developing and really focusing on.
So before we let you go, there's a question I want to ask that is a big question, but I think it's an important one, and it's one that maybe not in the same terms a lot of people are thinking about. So sort of the TV guide version of the history of Western thought. You've got sort of natural philosophy that combines humanities and sciences, splits into science and humanities, then kind of carves off the social sciences. And then it feels, the sciences become more and more important as their ability to kind of predict and therefore control the natural world increases. You sort of vividly see this in films like Oppenheimer, that we really begin to see what we can do. But an example of the humanities, by the way, but it feels to me that we're we're in a moment where, at least in some corners, it's not even really about humanities versus science. It's like everything versus technology, like a very narrow range of the sciences,
Yes.
of the engineering sciences. And it feels to me we're in a moment, coming back to this amazing word wisdom that is in the founding legislation, that I feel like we're in a moment where the masters of technology are also seen as having all of the wisdom, or the most important wisdom. Their voice seems to count for so much. Like, what's the argument for the humanities in this moment?
Right.
What's the role of the humanities in this moment? Where are we in the arc of our human stories and the power they can play in shaping our world?
You know, I appreciate that you brought up Oppenheimer. We do a lot of really great work and we don't get a lot of credit, and I think, you know, we have to do a much better job about telling our story and the impacts that we have. Oppenheimer is a movie that's based on a book, American Prometheus.
Yeah.
American Prometheus, one of the authors received an NEH grant to do some of the research on that.
What a great example.
So my thoughts about that, so, you know, we're moving into new areas. We're doing some really new, great work on AI from the humanities perspective. The thing about technology, science, and thinking about that as being the way forward and having all the wisdom is we don't know what's going to happen with that technology and science. Look at Oppenheimer. Look at what we learned. We don't learn that, though, until afterwards, right? Yeah. And it takes the humanities and the tools of the humanities to be able to look back and learn.
Yeah, that's the learning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's technology doesn't have that ability, right? Technology is moving forward with this assumption that this is what's going to happen. And sometimes it happens, but sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't and it fails terribly, it's the humanities that is going to help us learn and figure out how do we have to do it differently. So you can't untangle science and technology from humanities, because if we're going to learn from science and technology, it's the humanities part of it that we have to make sure that we're strong in, that we are understanding, and that we have the right tools to be able to really assess for ourselves the science and technology and what it means for us as human beings, what it means for the environment and the earth, and what it means for how we're going to think about the future. So I know that science and technology say they think about the future, but we have to assess it later in the future, and that's where the humanities are going to come in.
Well, Chair Lowe, thank you so much for being with us. Thanks for your leadership.
Thank you.